Hello and welcome to HITC Sevens, and to today's video, but just before I begin, I would like to apologise if my voice sounds a little different and a little coarser than usual. I'm afraid I am still yet to fully regain it following Tuesday afternoon celebrations, when England beat Germany at Wembley Stadium. If you'd like to know why, feel free to check out my vlog attending the game, which was hands down one of the best days of my life, so hopefully you can forgive me for sounding a little rough. And I will crack on. Those of you who follow me on Twitter will know that I'm a fully signed up and paying member of the Raheem Sterling fan club, and I have been long before I started this channel. From his early days at Liverpool to his breakthrough with England, I always thought there was something special about Sterling. I can remember the earliest criticisms of him whilst he was still a teenager playing in that front three alongside Luis Suarez and Daniel Sturridge, that he was just another pacey young English wide man who was one-dimensional and only had one outstanding attribute, likened to Aaron Lennon, Sean Wright-Phillips, and Theo Walcott. For the record, I don't think that is an accurate portrayal of any of those players, but it seemed particularly at odds with the player that I saw every time I watched Sterling in action. His movement was cute and clever, his touch was outstanding, and he could beat players just as easily with a drop of a shoulder as he could by beating them in a foot race. He never seemed like a kick it and run type of footballer to me. The first time I saw Sterling play, as far as I can recall, was at the 2011 Under-17 World Cup in Mexico, where he starred alongside the likes of current England #1, Jordan Pickford, then captain Nathaniel Chalobah, and defender Sam Magri, who was actually one of the first footballers I ever interviewed as a sports journalist, who now represents Malta at international level and plays his club football for Hamilton Waterlooville in the National League South. Sterling stood out a mile, and from that moment, I was hooked. Over the next 10 years, Sterling won back-to-back Young Player of the Year awards at Liverpool before becoming the most expensive English footballer of all time, at the time, in a transfer to Manchester City, worth a potential £49 million. He has won 9 trophies at the Etihad, scoring 114 goals in 292 games, and he has become one of the greatest English players of all time. That last claim will be the most controversial, given that the others are all indisputable facts, whilst that one is quite clearly my own personal opinion. But we'll circle back to that just a little bit later on. The long and short of it is that Raheem Sterling has achieved a great deal, even only at the midpoint in his career, yet he is still one of, if not the, most criticised footballer in all of England. Of course, part of that comes with the fact that he is one of the most high-profile players in England, and the larger your profile, the greater the scrutiny. Harry Kane is England's best player, yet he is also among the most heavily scrutinised, since expectations of him are so high, and England's reliance on him, rather unfairly, is deemed to be so great. However, even when Kane is being lambasted for going 3 games without a goal, as if that was some kind of criminal offence, few people would dispute that he is obviously a wonderful footballer and a masterful goalscorer. Or at least, I have come across very few people, either on the internet or in real life, who would take issue with that assessment. The same cannot be said for Raheem Sterling, who some people genuinely try to dismiss or at least greatly downplay his talents, so I wanted to make a video all about Raheem Sterling. His talents, his critics, his character, where he came from, where he's heading, and why 99% of the flack that he takes is spurious at best and rather sinister at worst. Sterling was born in Kingston, Jamaica, but moved to England with his mother at the age of 5, where the family settled in Brent, a stone's throw from the old Wembley Stadium. The old ground, renowned for its twin towers, was closed down during this same year that Sterling moved to London, and demolished when he was 9 years old. When the new Wembley opened, on the same site, Sterling was playing in the Queen's Park Rangers Academy, and he spent his early teens growing up in the shadow of the famous new Wembley Arch. Sterling is an Englishman, a Londoner turned Scouser turned Mancunian, who spent his formative years in the United Kingdom, but he is still very in touch with his Jamaican roots. Sterling's foundation, little talked about in the press and rarely self-promoted by the player himself, helps disadvantaged children in both London and Kingston, particularly in terms of getting university scholarships and work placements. Sterling himself had a challenging upbringing, and when he moved to London, he attended a school for children with special educational needs due to the lack of foundational learning that he had done up to that point. Sterling still emerged with GCSEs in all of the course subjects, despite splitting his time between school life and his already very promising career in youth team football. England have had fewer than 40 foreign-born internationals over the years, many of those dating back to the 1800s and the Age of Empire, in which players weren't really foreign-born at all, since the countries they were born in were technically part of Britain, just not England. When Sterling won his first cap for England in 2012, becoming only the fifth 17-year-old to be capped by England, a figure which has since risen to 6, thanks to Jude Bellingham, he followed in the footsteps of fellow Jamaican-born England internationals Luther Blissett and John Barnes. Tremendous footballers themselves, though also often criticised for their performances with the national team, Barnes and Blissett played a little bit before Sterling's time, and he grew up idolising Stoke City centre-forward Ricardo Fuller, who won 72 caps for the Reggae Boys but played his club football almost exclusively in England. Despite the criticism of Sterling from certain supporters and sections of the press over the years, those who actually work in football have seemingly never doubted his talents. A coveted youth team prospect at QPR, Sterling began representing England at under 16 level whilst he was still only 14 years old. At 15, he became the most expensive 15-year-old footballer of all time when he was signed by Liverpool for an initial £500,000, with the potential to rise to as much as £2 million, subject to add-ons. He soon became Liverpool's youngest goalscorer since Michael Owen, though he only actually scored 2 Premier League goals during his breakout campaign, a more prolific provider than scorer, notching 6 assists, mostly for Luis Suarez. Over the next 2 seasons, Sterling began to show a ruthlessness in front of goal and clinical final ball that is unusual for one so young, hitting double figures for both goals and assists in both campaigns in all competitions. I cannot stress how remarkable an achievement that is, and by 2014, age 19, Sterling was starting virtually every game for England under Roy Hodgson. As his star shone brighter and brighter, there were increasingly unkind articles written about Sterling within the English national press. Not necessarily scathing, just needlessly personal, lacking in public interest, and keen to portray Sterling as being someone with undesirable traits based solely upon his upbringing and hearsay. This shrieking reached fever pitch in 2015 when Sterling left Liverpool to join Manchester City, becoming the most expensive English footballer of all time in the process. Liverpool had finished 6th in the Premier League the previous season, roughly the same distance points-wise from that season's title winners Chelsea as they were from relegated Hull City. This was a time, unlike now, when Liverpool were no strangers to losing their best players. Luis Suarez had departed for Barcelona in 2014, Fernando Torres and Javier Mascherano had previously left for Chelsea and Barcelona respectively, meanwhile Xabi Alonso said his farewells in a move to Real Madrid. And yet, Sterling's departure was met with unique vitriol within the English press, and from what I've no doubt was a minority of Liverpool fans. The youngster was subject to a torrent of abuse, with national newspapers outright labelling him as greedy, and almost all of them joining forces to call the fee that Manchester City had paid for him outrageous and a total waste of money. Liverpool legend John Aldridge claimed that Jordan Ibe would become a better player than Sterling upon his departure. Meanwhile, Jamie Carragher and Jamie Redknapp were still claiming that Ibe was more talented than Sterling in 2016, by which stage such an argument was restricted surely only to those with a high degree of visual impairment. Jordan Ibe has shown flashes of brilliance in both the youth team game and senior team game, but nothing like the quality and consistency that Sterling had exhibited even as early as 2015. Hence why Man City were willing to fork out almost £50 million for him. The Ibe comparison is now a thing of legend, brought up on out-of-context Twitter pages and widely derided and mocked. But the disrespect of Sterling and the urge to dismiss his talents still goes on. The abuse and criticism that Sterling has faced since at least the age of 20 is an important part of his story, and one which we can't just gloss over. At its worst, Sterling has of course been subject to vile and virulent racism from both opposition and even his own so-called supporters, inspired often by the more subtle, coded, and dog-whistle racism that passes as journalism in this country. At the age of only 24, and clearly growing sick of this kind of thing, Sterling actually did something that very few people do, and pointed it out. He took a stand and used his sizable profile and large number of followers on social media to point out very clear examples of racism and the different ways in which people of colour are portrayed within large sections of the English press, sparking a conversation and shining a spotlight, albeit only briefly, within and outside of the world of football on how different sections of society are treated by certain media outlets, which made him, temporarily at least, untouchable to the likes of the Telegraph and the Sun, because most people could see through their stories calling him a footy idiot with a troubled past, lambasting him for getting a tattoo, buying his mum a house, and everything in between, and see them for what they really are and were. As is always the case, it doesn't take long for Fleet Street's nastiness to trickle down into the real world, resulting in scenes such as those seen at Stamford Bridge, where a supporter was handed a lifetime ban for hurling racial abuse at the England international. What's more, Sterling hasn't just had to deal with overt and sinister racism since his teens, he has also been subject to the most inane, ill-informed criticism for his talents as a player, largely by people who wouldn't be able to recognise a good footballer even if Lionel Messi and Ronaldinho were playing a 1-versus-1 game in their back gardens. And I'm not just talking about those comparisons with Jordan Ibe. This isn't a video about how dreadful particularly print media is in this country, though it is absolutely awful, but it speaks to Raheem Sterling's remarkable resilience, and also why so many people remain quick to play down his talents and make what are, in truth, some pretty bizarre assessments of him. In their late teens and early 20s, most people are still finding their way in life. Raheem Sterling is about a year older than me, and the most pressure or scrutiny that I came under in my late teens or early 20s was maybe the odd critical comment on an article I'd written when I was trying to make a living writing about football. Raheem Sterling had some of the biggest selling newspapers in Britain, prominent voices in our national discourse, and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of football fans, scrutinising him both fairly as a footballer, unfairly because they don't know much about football, and obviously totally unforgivably abusing him solely down to the colour of his skin. Much is made about footballers being precious prima donnas, but the reality couldn't be further from the truth. Raheem Sterling was forced to grow up, and grow up fast, and when most of us would have sunk, understandably so, he swam, and flourished, blocking out all of the noise, focusing religiously on his football, and becoming one of the best wide players in Europe. That brings us nicely to Sterling's game itself, something which I haven't talked about nearly enough just yet. The most common critique that I hear said of Raheem Sterling is that he only scores tap-ins, goals that look really straightforward to the average punter, that any England player could score. You know, a ball is played across the 6-yard box, Sterling taps it into the back of the net. So what? I could have scored from there, say mostly middle-aged men who would struggle to run from the halfway line of a football pitch to the 6-yard box without collapsing. I find it hard to believe that this point has to be made, but the skill in those kinds of goals, of the type that Sterling scores so often, is not in the finish itself, which, yes, is often relatively easy, but in getting there in the first place. That is Raheem Sterling's most outstanding attribute of all, in my eyes at least, his phenomenal movement. You can count on one hand the number of players in world football right now with more intelligent forward movement than Sterling, who is absolutely sensational at either drifting off the back of defenders or stealing in front of them in order to put the ball in the back of the net. Just take his goal against the Czech Republic at Euro 2020. He just headed the ball into the back of the net from a few yards out. That's simple enough. Not quite. Go and watch that goal again. The ball starts off on the right flank, and Sterling is already right in the centre of the goal, more central even than Harry Kane, in a perfect centre-forward position. As the ball goes across to the left of the pitch, Jack Grealish receives possession, creates half a yard for himself, and just dinks the ball up towards the back post. As Bukayo Saka runs in from right to left, misjudging the flight of the ball, the two Czech centre-backs get caught ball watching. In the meantime, Sterling peels off the back of not one, but both Czech defenders, leaving himself unmarked to the back post and able to head home. The finish might look easy enough, the movement might even look fairly simple if you go and watch it back, but it isn't at all. That's why Raheem Sterling has averaged more than 20 goals a season across the last 4 seasons and scored more than 30 goals in the 2019-20 campaign. If it was that easy or that straightforward, there would be lots of footballers commanding £50 million transfer fees and hitting 20 plus goals a season. There are not, because it is extremely difficult, especially to be as intelligent, as constantly on the move, and as sharp as Sterling is in the penalty box. There isn't a single player in the Premier League with better attacking movement than Raheem Sterling, and there are, at the very most, maybe 2 in the entire world. He's that good. Pippo Inzaghi, Gary Lineker, and Ruud van Nistelrooy all had similar movement inside of the 6-yard box, and scored almost exclusively tap-ins, but for some reason, in those cases, everyone seemed to understand that it was a remarkable football brain that put them in the right place at the right time, and not just some fluke they managed to repeat every week or a slice of divine intervention. Sterling is also absolutely sensational on the ball. His agility, close control, and his ability to beat players is outstanding, hence why players tend to stand so far off him, and so much, because they're scared to death of being skinned, and then he's either able to put a ball into the box or have a strike on goal. There were times in that Germany game in which Joshua Kimmich, who is a world-class footballer, looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him up every time Sterling received the ball. Jadon Sancho recently called Sterling the most skillful player in the England squad, but you very rarely hear his dribbling abilities and technique being talked about in such glowing terms by those who have never played against or alongside him. There are, of course, some legitimate criticisms of Raheem Sterling, and some deficiencies to his game. Whilst his movement ensures that he gets chances in virtually every game he plays in, there are times in which Sterling can be wasteful in front of goal. His ability on the ball and composure sometimes leads to a tendency to slow the game down, perhaps keeping hold of the ball for a little too long and running into dead ends. There are times where I think he should release the ball a little earlier and be a little bit punchier in his play. I think these are all genuine flaws to Sterling's game, but he does not cease to be a wonderful player because of them. Every player has flaws to their game. Lionel Messi isn't the most dominant in the air, and Cristiano Ronaldo is rubbish at taking free kicks. All players have weaknesses, but we tend to focus more on their strengths, of which Raheem Sterling has so many. Lazy, stupid, a tendency to make poor decisions, these are all tropes that have been used to describe black footballers for decades, often with very little in the way of evidence. But they are so palpably and laughably bewildering in the case of Raheem Sterling as to be absurd, given the fact that he is a remarkably intelligent footballer with a world-class work ethic and phenomenal determination. I don't think there is a single other England international who could score 3 goals in 4 games at a major tournament, including one against Germany, winning a Man of the Match award, and 15 goals in his last 20 international games, and still receive the kind of criticism that Raheem Sterling does, or face suggestions that he should be dropped, or that he hasn't justified his selection. Mark Twain once said, "Give a man a reputation as an early riser, and he can sleep till noon." And he wasn't wrong. In the case of Raheem Sterling, the newspapers gave him a reputation as a bad boy, someone who is unruly, ill-disciplined, greedy, stupid, wasteful in possession, and overrated, and never mind how much of a distinguished citizen Sterling makes himself, not that he has anything to prove anybody else, no matter how much charitable work he does, how many trophies he wins, goals he scores, or tough situations that he drags England out of, he will still be the same ill-disciplined, stupid, and greedy kid to some people. Once you come to terms with that fact, as sad as it may be, and as I am now starting to do, the criticism of Sterling becomes a little easier to block out, and presumably he learnt that himself many years ago. Some people will never change their minds, no matter how much evidence is presented right in front of their own eyes. Raheem Sterling is about to hit 100 Premier League goals. He has already scored more goals in the top flight of English football than Ruud van Nistelrooy, Fernando Torres, and Cristiano Ronaldo. Soon, he will leapfrog Didier Drogba, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if he went on to score more goals than Thierry Henry, a man who is widely regarded as being the greatest player to have graced the English game since the advent of the Premier League in 1992. Sterling has hit double figures for goals scored in all competitions in 8 successive seasons, despite the fact that he is only 26 years old. The boy is an absolute star, and he cannot be stopped. He is largely slated by people with 1/5 of his life experiences, despite Sterling being 26, not even a tenth of his understanding of football, and most likely less than 1% of his talent. No amount of mudslinging, booing, or underestimating can keep him down. In fact, at this point, it might just be adding fuel to the fire, and one suspects Sterling has had to compartmentalise and weaponise all of the unfair criticism, in its many forms, that he has received. Whatever he is doing, it's working. As an England fan, long may that continue. And, on a personal note, I'm absolutely delighted for the lad. Thank you all for watching today's video. I'm sure you all have different opinions on Raheem Sterling and how highly you rate him, but I think you'd have to be living under a rock for the last 10 years not to appreciate that what he has achieved in light of such a constant stream of criticism and backlash is pretty remarkable. Hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. You just do that by hitting the little bell icon for HITC Sevens. And you can also find me on social media on either Twitter or Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens, should you wish to do so.